Chapter 1062 of One Piece introduced us to not just Dr. Vegapunk, but a total of 7 Dr. Vegapunks. However, their naming patterns and classifications might be a bit confusing if you don't speak Japanese, so allow me to break it down for you. Welcome to Chapter Sequence, where we break down all the details in every One Piece chapter. Let's begin. On the cover page, Chocolate Town has been completely covered in ice. As you might recall, I mentioned several times that we still had no clarification of who the two figures that Chocolate Town were, as we know they were not Ichiji and Reiju. However, this ice can really mean almost only one thing: that Kuzen is here. That is particularly interesting as we know that for some unknown purpose, Kuzen is now currently allied with Blackbeard. This means that Kuzen could have come with another Titanic captain to invade Total Land for some purpose. A likely chance of that is that the road Poneglyph Big Mom has in her chateau, though I do wonder why Kuzen would bother freezing over Chocolate Town so far away. Among those frozen, we can also see several citizens who we've seen before in the story, and by the way, the chapter title follows the common pattern of Adventure in the Land of that has been the namesake of many openings to many One Piece arcs. As Vegapunk reveals herself, Franky is excited to introduce himself, since he did spend the timescape going through many of Vegapunk's designs. As I mentioned previously, there Franky found blueprints for a giant mech that Vegapunk was unable to complete as a young boy. However, Franky made those blueprints come to life during the timescape, but Vegapunk has already made a much better model. Vegapunk however reveals that, just as it is elaborated later in the chapter, she's one of several parts of Vegapunk. Now, it was clear something was up about this Vegapunk, but unlike some people thought, this is indeed the real Vegapunk, and not someone separate like a daughter or apprentice. However, she is not the only Vegapunk, as there is a total of 7 of them. As Kaku later explains, Vegapunk split his consciousness from his original body into 6 extra bodies to have more hands at work, with them wildly varying in ages and genders. So the one we see here is very much indeed Vegapunk, just only one of the aspects of their brain, which is why she speaks like an old man. How he managed to do this isn't really elaborated upon, but either he quite literally split the consciousness into artificial human life he created, or robotic bodies though they seem to be very human, or he potentially cloned parts of himself into different bodies. It remains to be seen how much these Vegapunks share consciousness, or if they're quite literally clones of the same exact person but with different free wills, despite all of them being Vegapunk. The original Dr. Vegapunk is called the Stella, which is the Italian and Latin word for star, whereas the other 5 bodies are the satellites. The kanji for Stella reads as Hontai, making it clear that the Stella is the original of the Vegapunks. On the other hand, the satellites are written with the kanji for cat. This is because, as Kaku puts it, due to being short on time, Vegapunk would rather have a cat lend him a hand, which is a Japanese idiom for getting help, similar to the English proverb, 2 minds are better than 1. The reason for this naming system is likely the idea that Vegapunk is a star, while all the satellites revolve around him. In this case, each of the remaining punks are known by a given name, but each of them have a kanji reading that describes their personality. Punk 1 is Shaka with the kanji which can mean justice or righteousness, or generally the concept of good. Punk 2 is pronounced as Ridisu, likely Lilith, with the kanji for Aku, which means wickedness or evil. Punk 3 is Edison, with the kanji So, which means thoughts or thinking. Punk 4 is Pythagoras, with the kanji Chi, which means wisdom, knowledge. Punk 5 is Atlas, with the kanji Bo, which means violence, aggression, though in the chapter Atlas appears to be Punk 6, so this is likely to be a mistake in the Jam magazine that will be corrected. Finally, Punk 6, or likely Punk 5 given that error, is pronounced as Yoku. This could be Yoke, Yolk, or York, though it might just be the pronunciation of its kanji, which is simply Yoku, meaning desire or greed. These names make it very evident that each of these Vegapunks represent a different aspect of Vegapunk's brain that has been split into all of these different bodies. His moral just side, his wicked mischievous side, his thinking calculative side, his knowledgeable wise side, his violent instinctual side, and his greedy desiring side. Personalities we clearly see reflected in the 3 satellites we already met. Given their number and their personalities though, I wonder if there's also a connection to the 7 deadly sins. Lilith could be pride or greed, Atlas could be wrath, and Yoku could be lust or greed, but it's still too early to really be able to make a proper connection. The real fascinating thing about the names of these satellites, however, is that how they are all connected to a satellite, our most important in fact, the moon. A Shaka moon is a term used for a full moon, whereas a Lilith moon is a term used for a dark moon. The former is named after the person who became the Gautama Buddha after reaching the enlightenment of justice and righteousness, whereas the latter is named after a mischievous figure of Judaic mythology, which fits both of their personalities, the righteous one and the mischievous one. Furthermore, though, Edison and Pythagoras are both clearly named after the famous inventor and mathematician, one who came up with a lot of ideas and one who was very wise, which fits both of those descriptors and the technology setting. But Edison, Pythagoras, and Atlas are all craters on the moon. Really, the only outlier here is Yoku, who is just named after his own kanji, rather than having a separate name with a specific connection to the moon, at least apparent at first, which ties all of these satellites to the satellite that is the moon, while the original Vegapunk is the sun, the stella or star, since in Japanese the word star can refer to either a star or a planet. We'll have to see if this has any deeper connection with the lore or if this is simply a reference to the science and futuristic association of space, as if Vegapunk already reached beyond the stars. Anyway, during this scene we get a look at Lilith and Shaka, and as outlined before, we get a good look at their personalities. Speaking of the latter, we get to see a look at their design, with a helmet that very much looks almost identical to that of famous artists Daft Punk, which is fitting given the punk in their name. At the same time, the helmet also looks strikingly similar to that of the Warrior of the Sea, Sora, which only further proves the connection between Vegapunk and Sora that was already apparent in Lilith's appearance. Shaka does not seem to have the same speech pattern Lilith has, though they haven't used their pronouns yet, so it's hard to tell, as well as their gender, which is still a mystery. The speech pattern sounds a bit masculine, but it's really hard to tell. Lilith manages to surround the Straw Hats with a bunch of weaponized CBs, which is an evolution of what Vegapunk has achieved during his youth by weaponizing the animals of Karakuri Island, not to be mistaken with last chapter's Mega Shark, which seemed to be entirely robotic, but now has managed to do so with much bigger animals. Would they be able to weaponize things such as Sea Kings? CBs are already scary enough on their own, but Sea Kings would put Vegapunk on a power not that far from that of Poseidon, if a bit more limited. Each of the Straw Hats is reacting differently to Vegapunk, with Frankie fanboying, Sanjay falling in love, Usopp freaking out, Nami hanging on to Robin out of fear, and Robin and Zoro ready to strike Vegapunk. Zoro particularly asked her if he can make a request. What this is we don't know, but I feel a good guess would be if Vegapunk can undo the effects that the smile fruits that Caesar have caused, which is no doubt something they should be able to do. Given how Zoro felt very enraged by what Orochi and Caesar did with the smiles, it would make sense he would want to help it turn people like those of Okobore back to normal. Back on Bonnie's side, Bonnie reveals that Kuma is indeed her father. As I mentioned before, Bonnie's favorite card in 2018 included a note that said, "Wants to make Vegapunk restore her father," though it wasn't known if this was an accidental slip-up or a scrapped idea. However, this confirms this was indeed accidentally revealed, as she is in fact Kuma's daughter, which makes her the princess of the Sorbet Kingdom and likely Connie's daughter or granddaughter. This would make her the new princess of the arc, as is usual with Oda. Her saying she wants to restore Kuma indicates that he can likely be reverted, which indicates Kuma was likely another fake death that can result in him coming back to normal if his personality was backed up somewhere or hidden somewhere inside him. Bonnie also mentioned how she had been to Egghead in the past and how she knew Vegapunk, which makes me wonder just how exactly she went from the East Blue to the Grand Line, only to then go back, and why exactly Kuma went with Vegapunk together with Bonnie there. The group walks into the inside of Egghead, only to be greeted by a surreal futuristic theme park. There's a lot to break down here, so let's go structure by structure. On the left there is something that looks like a giant Famicom controller, with what looks like stacks of Jenga-like blocks above it. To the right is a dome with rocket-shaped houses and its own weather inside, with the writings Vegapunk on it. The space between them makes me wonder if that's how Vegapunk's name is meant to be written, or if it's just for the sake of this writing. There's also the use of star symbology, which again is very similar to the one Frankie uses. Above them are a giant mech and an alien-looking kaiju, lasers and all, though even more weirdly above them under the dome are a set of flying fish, including a whale, just floating in the air, likely more holograms like the two giant creatures. And if you look behind them, you can spy the writing SSG, which stands for Special Science Group, Vegapunk's research unit, which now makes me wonder if the entire unit really just consists of the 7 Vegapunks, since she later comments how all engineers are unreliable and only themselves can build such creations, which is likely why Vegapunk decided to split to begin with. Meanwhile, behind them, Jinbe is being a gentleman and helping Bonnie out of the hatch. Bonnie also very briefly mentions how she met with Sabo, which is in an unlikely scenario since the two had the same objective to rescue Kuma, so they undoubtedly cross paths with each other. The group, however, spots a giant parfait, and the three leap towards it to devour it. Chopper quickly hands his hat to Jinbe so he can dive straight into the food. However, much like the kaiju, the food is a hologram, which, as Bonney explains, is basically just 3D projection of light, though it only exists in fiction as we've never really seen it before in the series, until Vegapunk was able to make it a reality. Luffy is so devastated by lack of parfait that he almost enters Gear 5th mode for a moment, which even some slight Conqueror's Haki being visible. Punk 6, Wrath Atlas, appears, explaining how, just as we speculated, Vegapunk managed to master the island heating system he wanted to develop as a child, allowing for a tropical island despite the nearby winter waters. She describes it as quite literally the island's aircon or air conditioning. Vegapunk Atlas herself has a really peculiar design, with bicolored hair similar to Uta's, what seem to be like sheep-like ears, and wool around her neck. In later shots, we can also spot what looks like a tail. She also has the same boots Lilith has, and rocket engines on her back, which allow her to fly like a jetpack. She also possesses photonic gloves, which let her interact with light and do things like punch holograms. Her speech pattern is also quite childish, sounding like a little child prone to anger swings. She's also big to boot, as Luffy says she's about Kaido's size. Luffy at first thinks she's a hologram, so he calls her a horo, in reference to hologram or horogram in Japanese. However, this could be a reference to Perona, since her horo fruit allowed her and her ghost to phase through anything like holograms, where Luffy was unable to touch them just like he can't hear, so he might be making an intentional reference. Atlas's design is most likely referencing that of Astro Boy. Though not as known in a lot of the West, Astro Boy, or Tetsuan Atom in Japanese, is an icon in Japan, being one of the most famous characters made by legendary mangaka Osamu Tezuka. The reference becomes very apparent in her design, but becomes more obvious when rearranging the kana in Atlas's name in Japanese, Atorasu, into Asutora or Astora, which sounds incredibly close to Astro Boy. Atlas ends up punching Luffy into the vending machine, which has the settings East, West, South, and North, which results in a fast food set: burger, fries, and cola, or rather Vega Cola, the latter bearing a star symbol and a stripe similar to that of the Vega Force. Atlas introduces herself properly as Dr. Vegapunk, using the same statement Lilith used, being a humble, higher genius scientist. Luffy is shocked as he mentions that Kobe told him about Vegapunk, which references chapter 433, when Vegapunk was first mentioned by name. However, despite this shocking revelation, the sound effects in the background still read as ume or delicious, since Luffy and Chopper are still stuffing themselves despite the shock. We cut to outside waters, where in a government ship, Lucci, Kaku, and Khalifa are heading to Egghead. This alone is a very exciting prospect, since it means Lucci could meet again with Luffy, or even someone like Robin. On the table we can spot 3 masks, including Lucci's, and what are most likely Kaku's and Stussy's. Behind Lucci is a set of drinks, since brandy is his favorite food, and of course behind them is the massive Kuma Seraphim, once again bearing the star pattern we've seen so many times from Vegapunk. Though oddly enough, despite having dark skin and black wings, this Seraphim does not seem to have white hair, and I can't really seem to see fire either. Is there a reason for it? We actually saw the team not too long ago in chapter 1028, potentially already on the way to Egghead or preparing to. Interestingly, in that chapter, the CP0 agent told Lucci that Momonosuke must have been Vegapunk's artificial fruit, meaning that Vegapunk lied to the government about the failure of the fruit. Well, it could potentially be why Lucci has been dispatched to raise Vegapunk, since the government is seeing them as too much of a liability, given how they hid the existence of the artificial devil fruit from them. The term erase is also fitting, given the language that has been used before with it to erase the lights King Emu deemed inconvenient. Lucci himself interestingly wonders if this has to do with the incident of the Lasha Kingdom. However, Stassi and Kaku tell him not to put his nose where he shouldn't, since obviously they aren't meant to know about King Emu's affairs, and while they all likely suspect that something is pulling the strings in the world government, even just considering the idea could result in serious danger for them. Still, this is a very interesting connection, because it would explain what happened at the Lasha Kingdom. The weapon that was unleashed on it might have actually been a creation of Vegapunk, which would explain why its shape looked a bit like a UFO, and it shot down lasers, something right up Vegapunk's futuristic alley. This would make sense too, since it seems more evident now that past few chapters have not really served much as a post-arc, but if anything more all just set up for Egghead. The Seraphim being unleashed on Amazon Lily, Lasha King being destroyed. It would also explain why this weapon hasn't been used previously for things like Ohara, since Vegapunk only developed it recently, though it does bring into question how God Valley's disappearance happened. It could also be that now that King Emu plans to use this weapon against the world, then perhaps keeping its secrecy might be part of the reason why they want to dispose of Vegapunk. However, this setup makes it only all the more likely that Vegapunk might indeed be an ally, as we speculated, with the Straw Hats perhaps facing off against CP0 in this shorter arc, or some other threat. Things are already heating up in this arc, so let's see how this adventure evolves.